Okay, welcome back everybody. In this episode, we're delving into the self-managed super fund space and we're asking the question, should you use your self-managed super fund to buy a property? Before we get into any specifics, this content in this podcast is only general in nature. It does not constitute financial, legal, or tax advice, and it's strongly recommended that you seek professional advice regarding your personal situation. That being said, I'm surrounded by our property power team here, Mike O'Malley, mortgage manager from Rate Money, Sydney CBD, Andrew Chan, strategic financial planner from Phoenix Private Wealth Management, George Coletti, principal accountant from Access Professional Services, Daniela Musitano, founder and executive director from Tidal Space Conveyancing, and myself, Gianni Musumeci, investment property advisor from Leverage Property Advisors. So look, I might kick off with you, Andrew. Is it a worthwhile endeavor looking to purchase property through your self-managed super fund?
It's a good question, Gianni. Like I have been, I'm just going to wind back the conversation because in financial planning, it's should you even set up a self-managed super fund is really the question that people need to answer, and it's a different answer for your circumstances. Each person's circumstances are unique. So, probably the best step. Financial advisors are the place to go to when you're getting advice for setting up a self-managed super fund, and it's important that anyone seeking to set up a SMSF seeks advice. And one of the requirements when you're setting up a self-managed super fund is that as a member, you're also a director, which means that you're responsible to adhere to your obligations as a trustee to make sure that those benefits, any decisions you make for buying investments in your self-managed super fund is there to solely benefit that member for retirement. And so the requirements are to seek financial advice from professionals in your decision making, have an investment strategy of, what you're investing in and why. And that's why it's so important to seek that advice. And not only that is that it's you're making a change to your circumstance. So when we're giving advice around setting up self-managed super funds, we need to look at, what investments and what assets, what cash flow will fund that self-managed super fund, right? So, you'll have insurances that you might have bought property for your principal place of residence, and you're relying on those risk management policies inside your current superannuation fund. If you just blindly roll those over to your self-managed super fund, you can lose those insurance policies. So it's one of the things that we do, and we review and we provide that advice to make sure that nothing's lost in that transition and that it's appropriate. Now, buying a property in SMSF, to be fair, any entity that you create has a cost. Like, you'll go to the accountant to, once you've received advice, to set that up. And there'll be the accounting costs, there'll be the auditor costs, there possibly, depending on your life stage, actuarial costs. And so in running the compliance of the fund, there are your responsibilities that you are responsible for. What is the downside is if you don't adhere to those responsibilities, all those tax-free benefits that you might receive, that tax effectively, if there's a taxable component in that fund and you have not executed your responsibilities adequately, it means that the fund's non-complying, which means that you could lose half the fund. And this is what people forget. But SMSF and property as a tool for the right circumstances, the right situation, can be very effective. So when we talk about buying property, I myself, and feel free for anyone to chime in, I feel property is best bought personally. And the reason for that is because you have high marginal tax rates. And so, for example, if I was to gear and borrow money, an example, I'll get more money back from the ATO because I earn and I pay more in tax. The superannuation environment is a very concessionally taxed environment. You're taxed at 15%, so it's not as effective. Now, if you have strategies outside and inside and you have plenty, then there's no reason why you shouldn't. There's also some myths that I'll probably help Australians. We all have this idea to buy that home in Noosa or Hawke's Nest or wherever it might be at Port Douglas as a holiday home, and you know what? Every time we go up for our family holiday, it keeps getting more and more expensive. Why don't we set up a self-managed super fund, and why don't we just buy a property from the Gold Coast and whack it there? And the reality is that people don't know is that you can't use it, right? So there needs to be an arm's length. It can't be what we call an in-house asset. In-house assets in a self-managed super fund are limited to 5%. Good luck buying a single property in a self-managed super fund. So there's a whole host of, I'm a self-managed super fund specialist. That's with the Self-Managed Super Fund Association. That's the highest designation, along with the Self-Managed Super Fund Auditor, that you can have to give advice on these. So just when you're getting advice, make sure you get advice from not only a professional that's adequately qualified, because there's a whole host of different rules and regulations around self-managed super fund that advisor can help guide you so you don't make those mistakes if you're not necessarily an expert yourself. But where the golden nugget where self-managed super fund on property really makes sense is when you're a business owner. And really it's what we call business real property. So you're a business owner and you have a place that you operate from, and that's what we call your business premises. It might be a warehouse, it might be a factory, it might be a unit in the city, a suite. Then you can put it in your property. And so you go from a situation where you might be paying $100,000 rent at Barangaroo, and you're saying, whoa, why am I doing that when I could just buy a property in my SMSF and I will have that paid off in 10 years or less. And so then there's questions around, can I do that outright? Or if I can't do that outright, do I use borrowing? And then the strategies get more complex.
Because I think in that example, you have the benefits of being both owner and tenant in some respect. So from a tax perspective, how does that typically work when you're setting up a self-managed super fund with that in mind, being a business real property owner?
It's actually a pretty good strategy to have. But I usually have these discussions with Andrew anyway, because one thing that's super important when making that consideration, and I tell this to my clients all the time, is that purchase standalone still a good investment? Like if you weren't able to lease it because you either your business outgrew, or you decided to close down or do something else, would that investment still stand as a good investment on its own? And if the answer is yes, then I'd go to Andrew and say, have a look at this. What do you think as an alternative for them to use as an investment? Because I think it's a great strategy. Moving forward I suppose, as far as superannuation works, if they're holding that asset long term, and again, depends on the stage of their life, what their business makeup is, what their family makeup is, how much money they're earning in their business, can they support it? Or if all of these boxes and so forth are ticked, and they're holding that property until they reach preservation age and then click it over into pension mode if they decide to retire, then they sell the property, subject to obviously the new limits and, the revaluations and everything that, unfortunately, Andrew and I have been, thwart with and discussing all the time at the moment. They can basically have no capital gains and live on the earnings of that because they're going to realise that property.
Yeah, I think that's important to know. There were a couple of things there as well, is coming from a business real properties perspective is, yes, businesses upsize and they might move on, or they might shut down the business, and you need to consider the asset as a standalone asset rather than something that you use. And from a investment perspective, commercial and industrial property, typically they have longer vacancy periods as well. So there'll be a cash flow deficit that you'll need to fund.
And you've got to consider that. Absolutely.
Yeah, for sure, 100%. And winding back a little bit more, Mike, to the lending perspectives around purchasing property, whether it be residential, commercial, or otherwise, how does that stack up, or how does that differ inside a self-managed super fund?
Yeah, it's interesting. And I think George and Andrew have sort of adequately covered a lot of the aspects of it. I mean, to state the most obvious point, the borrower is your SMSF. It's not you personally. And it's what's called limited recourse borrowing. So you've got a level of protection when you buy in a super fund. More generally, there are less lenders operating in the space, so your borrowing options are a bit more restricted, and the interest rates will generally be a little bit higher. When someone comes to an SMSF loan, you need a very fixed structure behind you. You've got to have the SMSF set up properly by, the likes of George, or the advice and the structure in place with these two. You have to have a very clear strategy behind the super fund's investment plans, and the borrowing must fit that strategy. So there are a few restrictions around it. I mean, you can't just go and improve a property inside an SMSF. There are rules around what you can do to the property or with the property. So they're slightly more restrictive.
Yeah.
But for the reasons outlined by Andrew, they also make quite a good deal of sense.
Yeah, that's right. It may be coming back to the financial planning or the tax legitimacy of it as well. There's a lot of restrictions around purchasing property and what you do with that property inside SMSF. So you can't change the material characteristics of the property. You can't change it from a 3 to a 4-bedder or put a pool in or knock it down and that sort of stuff. So it becomes quite restrictive. From a legal perspective, what are some of the differences between buying in your own name versus buying in a self-managed super fund, Daniela, that people should be aware of?
Well, the conveyance is the same, so that doesn't change. I guess what is important when a client comes to us to say, I'm buying with my self-managed super fund, the first thing is give us a copy of the trust deed. Because what we see more and more often, especially if the contract is not if the exchange is not done by the solicitors, is the wrong name on that front page. And George and I talk about it all the time. Actually,
Constantly.
George, we had a client client of George that came to us when he purchased the conveyancer, the agent, I don't know, we were not involved in that transaction, had the wrong name on the contract.
Wow.
So the title was incorrectly registered. So then when he was doing the tax return, they realized that and they came to us to say, we now need to change the title from this entity to this entity. So you run through all the process, like having revenue will need to approve it, make sure that you don't have to pay stamp duty twice. So there's a lot of legal implications if that first step is not done correctly. And that's what we have to make sure of.
And the vendors aren't always cooperative if you need to make a change to the contract either. I mean, they can be, but they don't have to be.
Correct. Like once that contract is signed and then we realize, there's been an error, maybe the agent put the wrong name in the front page and the contract comes to us and was already exchanged, not always the other side will agree to have that change made.
Having said that was a new client because we always look at that and send them to Daniela straight away. So
Yeah.
they're always getting it right.
Yeah. So look, it's probably easy to get wrong, something that might be overlooked, but that has big legal implications down the track.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
I think that just goes to show like you need your conveyancer as the last line of defense in your property transaction.
Always.
Especially with an SMSF.
Yeah.
One thing that, Daniela does for us with quite a few clients is, particularly with the limited recourse borrowings, which, Mike organises for them, is that once the debt is paid, and there's stamp duty concessions, which Daniela is fully aware of and uses to her advantage, and we transfer that property from the Bare Trust back into the super fund's name. And Daniela takes care of all of that, so it's seamless and tax-free.
Yeah, awesome.
It always gives you a good deal of comfort to know that you review the contract before they sign.
The trust, we always ask for a copy of the trust to make sure that that name is the correct name, that it's going on the contract. Yeah.
Yeah.
And you've got differences between states,
Absolutely. I've seen that many times now.
Correct. In New South Wales, what it goes in the contract in New South Wales, what then reflects on the title search is different from Queensland. And
I'm sure there's a few horror stories that you could probably share.
yes.
Yeah.
What do you mean? Nothing ever goes wrong.
I've actually had clients that have sold a property inside the SMSF because after 3 years of ownership, they realized that it was a cash flow burden on them. And so there's all sorts of costs there because they were negative gearing inside a self-managed super fund, and George is shaking his head. And, as a result, they've had to put more money into superannuation, and then the opportunity cost associated with that as well, where they could have invested in something else that was, cash flow neutral or something that grew in value more at a lower price point or whatever.
From all of our points, that particular example is so important. And what we highlight here is get the right advice in the first place, structure it correctly, understand the cash flow, get the right lending, and then pick the right property, which is primarily the most important thing. Get the right asset.
100%.
I am seeing now actually people, exactly as you say, transfer back into their individual names
Oh, wow.
from the self-managed super fund.
I probably want to add to that. There's a big smoking gun in the industry at the moment where there's a lot of property spruikers hiring a junior accountant who doesn't really understand what's going on to just sell the products, right? So what's driving the setup of these self-managed super funds is a property developer wanting to sell their goods, right? And that's not putting the client's interest first, because whenever pick up a strategy, you need to know that, as I've said before, you got to hold on to it to see the benefit. And if you're selling it after 3 years, it's very unlikely that you're selling it because you've made money. You're selling it because you can't afford it. And in a world where if employment suddenly is taking a turn for the worse, and you're not only confident of holding your strategy of properties or geared assets outside, it impacts that what in the beginning when you first buy that asset, it might be neutrally geared, hopefully not negatively geared. So, in SMSF, what we call LRBAs, limited recourse borrowing arrangements, the banks are really lending between 60 to 70%, usually around that 65%. So if it's an okay property, it will be slightly negative to positive, right? But if you're negative already from the outset, then it relies heavily upon your SG, your super guarantee contributions, to allow for that. And that means that you need to contribute consistently, and you need to be stable in your job, in your business, and that's cash flow.
Yeah.
If you wind it back one more, it's to say what amount is the correct amount to set up a self-managed super fund. And so, there is a minimum of what we say 200, ASIC says, the regulator, the Australian Securities and Investment Commission, say 200,000 to 250 means that the accountancy fees make sense as a proportion of that fund. And what we really, in our industry, financial planning, we don't like to see is funds being set up with $50,000, right? Because then, for example, you have your accountancy costs is like such a high proportion of what that setup value is, and you would have to borrow so much, not that. And so, if you're in that situation, that's not the right situation. You don't want to put, the situation, there's nothing wrong with the strategy, but if it's executed poorly, it can destroy wealth. And so, what I would say is to make sure that you've got adequate money there, but also as part of what we do is we listen to regulators and we're listening to what they're looking for. And the ATO and ASIC do not want to see single funds with only one asset in there.
Yeah.
So it's not only a matter of that I can afford the stamp duty, I can afford the property, that I can afford the loan. You also need to have and Mike, correct me, is you have to have a large buffer there to allow for it. And so the ATO is looking for diversification within the fund. They don't want to see a SMSF set up with just one property sitting inside, because that is not diversification.
Yeah, it's interesting. Just off the back of that, a couple of things. I mean, the lenders have been trying to be more flexible, and so we've seen LVRs increase. It's not hard to borrow at 80% in an SMSF now. So you can, but you need to think about, is that the right thing to do? So this is why, for me, the advice part is very, very important. A lot of the lenders have reduced their minimum net fund asset requirements as well. So you don't necessarily always have quite that cushion there that you alluded to. And people do need to think about the ongoing costs of operating in an SMSF, because there are quite onerous annual compliance and reporting requirements, and they need to be funded. So yeah, there's a bit to think about.
Touching on that point there, and going back to the conveyancing, with the type of lenders that will lend to the self-managed super fund, they're now requiring independent advice, which often, like, we can't do in the same transaction, so we refer out somebody else to do it. So that's another cost associated in the conveyancing. You require another $1,000 there to get the independent advice.
From my perspective, what I've seen, and probably the biggest takeaway for all the viewers, would be that don't put the cart before the horse. So if you've got financial planners or, spruikers that are saying out there, come and buy a property from us, we can do it all through your SMSF. And they will basically set you up with a property that is, number one, overpriced, because they've already loaded up all of the commissions and so forth into it. And the biggest issue is I've had new clients come on board that have got these structures already in place, which really, they weren't appropriate. And I've gone through them with Andrew and said, no, they should never have had it in the first place, because they didn't have enough. And then they're looking at, how do I unwind it now? Because I've just got this property, which we've now looked at the valuation. It's actually 50 grand less than what we actually bought it for. So don't do it the other way around. If you're looking at, overall, am I going to buy a property in a superannuation fund? The short answer is there is some great advantages if it's the right purpose. Go to the property buyer's agent first to find the right property, and then get the lender and the planner to actually incorporate as part of your structure.
Yeah, I'm seeing that a lot lately, like people advertising specifically house and land packages through your self-managed super fund. And to your point, they're all in-house, junior, broker, advisor, accountant, whatever. They'll set up the structure and then, they'll buy a house and land package out in the sticks in a developing area with no infrastructure. And then, 2-3 years later, they're 50 grand short. So look, there's plenty of horror stories out there, I'm sure. But look, thank you guys for your time. Really appreciate that. There's a lot to unpack here in this episode, and we could probably talk about self-managed super fund and the perils all day, but really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks, Johnny.
Thanks.